economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
Imagine a moment when the familiar world order begins to crack at the seams. When a country that has been considered a junior partner of the United States for decades suddenly decides to stop playing by American rules. When economic dependence becomes a weapon, and that weapon is turned against the one who created it. This is not fantasy or the plot of a dystopian novel. Canada is no longer what it once was. And it all started with one decision in Washington.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
When Donald Trump returned to the White House, he promised to make America great again, restore manufacturing, and force its neighbors to respect the United States. But within a few months, his tariff policy set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. Factories in rural America began to close. Workers who voted for America First lost their jobs. And companies that had been manufacturing equipment for the Canadian market for decades suddenly realized that it was now more profitable to assemble it in Germany rather than Nebraska. Yes, because of American tariffs, it became cheaper to ship a tractor across the ocean than across the border with Canada. At this time, Ottawa was preparing for its own historic turnaround. Cautious politicians were replaced by a man who could not be called a populist, Mark Carney, an economist and former head of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. He did not shout slogans, wave flags, or threaten neighbors. He simply knew how the global economy worked and understood that when America burns bridges, new ones must be built. Within a few months, Carney had concluded strategic agreements with Europe, Indonesia, and Mexico. He opened up markets that had previously seemed unattainable to Canada, while also strengthening the domestic market by removing barriers between provinces.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
Meanwhile, American farmers were facing ruin. Exports to China collapsed, production costs rose, and debts grew faster than the harvest. Statistics showed what the White House did not want to see. Agricultural bankruptcies had nearly doubled. Tourism from Canada to the US had fallen by a third. Billions of dollars that had previously flowed into American border towns stayed at home in Canada. And at the very moment that Trump was complaining to the UN in New York about a faulty escalator, Mark Carney was signing agreements in London with funds managing hundreds of billions of dollars. While one sought applause, the other was building a new economic reality. And it was then that it became clear, North America would never be the same again. For the first time in a generation, Canada is not just defending its interests, it is dictating the terms. And the US, accustomed to playing the role of big brother, finds itself playing catch-up. This is a story about how a trade war turned into a strategic defeat, how an attempt to isolate a neighbor gave rise to its independence, and how a man whom Trump underestimated managed to outplay him in the economic arena. This is not about the past, it is about the future that has already arrived. Canada has broken the chain. And now there is only one question: what will remain of American leadership when the smoke clears?
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
It all began not with loud slogans or military parades, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in perception, as if the northern border of North America had suddenly come to life, breathing in a new way. In the spring of 2025, for the first time in a long time, Canadians felt not irritation or fatigue, but genuine pride. After several years of endless trade threats, humiliating comments from Washington, and constant attempts to impose their terms, they finally saw that the world no longer revolves around America. Sociologists recorded a record high. More than 70% of Canadians said that Donald Trump's policies had not weakened their country, but, on the contrary, had strengthened its sense of identity. Almost 8 out of 10 said outright that they would never vote to join the US, even if it meant economic benefits. And it wasn't just about the numbers. Something important was happening even at the symbolic level. Posters with the slogan "Independent North" began to appear in Canadian cities, a slogan previously used only by marginal activists. Television channels aired analytical programs about how, in just a few years, America had gone from being a strategic partner to a source of instability. Parliament discussed the idea of gradually phasing out the use of the US dollar in cross-border transactions, an idea that seemed fantastical just a couple of years ago. The atmosphere in society had changed. Irritation gave way to determination. Canadians no longer wanted to be the 51st state, they wanted to be a country capable of standing on its own 2 feet.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
But the real drama began further south. In Nebraska, in the heart of the American Midwest, thousands of class factory workers gathered in the auditorium. The company's management announced that the production of equipment intended for the Canadian market would be moved overseas. Not to Mexico, as had been the case before, and not to China, as the unions feared, but to Germany. The reason was Donald Trump's new tariff policy. Due to the tariffs imposed, the cost of transporting a combine harvester from the US to Canada turned out to be higher than shipping the same combine harvester from Europe. It seemed absurd, but the calculations left no room for doubt. American tariffs made domestic production uncompetitive on its own continent. Within a few weeks, 3 other major agricultural equipment manufacturers and 2 automotive companies made similar decisions. According to Bloomberg, one of them was considering moving part of its assembly operations to Belgium in order to serve the Canadian market without additional taxes. Another was considering moving to Ireland. Although the White House tried to present this as temporary adjustments to supply chains, investors understood that this was the beginning of a systemic crisis. American industry, which had been promised a revival, was losing ground faster than in the early 2000s.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
From an economic point of view, everything looked simple. Canada had a free trade agreement with the European Union CETA, under which 98% of goods were exempt from duties. When the US imposed tariffs on supplies to Canada, European companies found themselves in ideal conditions for expansion. German factories began working 3 shifts to meet the new demand. French agricultural equipment suppliers increased exports by 40% in just 6 months. Even Italian wine and grain processing equipment manufacturers opened offices in Saskatchewan and Manitoba for the first time in 20 years. Everything that America could not or did not want to supply, Europe was ready to offer.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
And political unrest began in the United States. Trade unions published open letters accusing Trump of betraying the interests of workers. Newspapers such as the Des Moines Register ran headlines such as "Our combine harvesters are now German." But in Washington, this was perceived as minor fluctuations against the backdrop of the Great Trade War for national revival. The president assured that the temporary losses would pay off, that in a year or 2, production would return to America with redoubled force. However, the economy does not forgive ideological blindness. While Trump was speaking at rallies, explaining how his tariffs were bringing China and Canada to their knees, analysts in Ottawa were already calculating the benefits. Canadian companies began to occupy the vacated niches. Domestic stimulus programs allowed dozens of companies to expand their exports to European markets. Investment from the EU grew by 25%, and capital inflows from Asia by 18%. For the first time in decades, the Canadian economy was growing faster than the American economy. And although part of this growth was due to temporary factors, the trend was clear. The northern neighbor was no longer dependent on the southern one. At the political level, it looked like a new kind of Cold War, not tanks and missiles, but tariffs, contracts, and consumer loyalty. American goods began to disappear from Canadian store shelves. Instead, German tools, French products, and Korean electronics appeared. Even in the entertainment industry, Canadian media companies began to actively promote their own content, limiting the purchase of American TV series. Ratings showed that viewers were enthusiastic about this. People wanted to see themselves, not a reflection of Hollywood. However, for the US, the consequences were much deeper than just economic losses. Trump's tariff policy destroyed the foundation of American influence trust. When the White House began to use trade as a tool of pressure, even close allies felt threatened. If tariffs can be imposed on Canada today, they can be imposed on anyone tomorrow. This made dozens of countries wonder, is it even worth dealing with America if partnership can turn into punishment?
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
It was at this moment that the world witnessed what historians would later call the Carney effect. Canada unexpectedly became a symbol of economic pragmatism and political maturity. It did not engage in direct conflicts or respond with threats, but each of its steps was well thought out and precise. When Washington closed one door, Ottawa opened three others in Brussels, Jakarta, and Mexico City. By the fall of 2025, the situation had become irreversible. The market, which for decades had been considered a natural extension of the American economy, was no longer so. Instead, a new system was forming, one that was open, multidirectional, and independent. Canada was no longer an appendage. It became the center around which other players began to revolve. Meanwhile, irritation was growing in America. The Midwest was plunging into an economic storm. Factories were idle, farmers were going bankrupt, and the government blamed everyone from the European Union to ungrateful neighbors. But the truth was obvious: the crisis was of their own making. And if Canada had previously accepted its role as a junior partner, it now saw itself as the leader of a new northern coalition. Thus, the chain that had bound the two countries for nearly a century began to break. Not loudly, not immediately, but inexorably. It all started with a few signed decrees on tariffs and ended with a tectonic shift in the political consciousness of the continent. America wanted to strengthen its influence and lost it. Canada just wanted to survive and found its own strength.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
This moment will go down in history as the point where America first became America alone, and where, for the first time in a generation, a small northern country was able not only to say no, but to do so with dignity, composure, and calculation that left Washington bewildered. When Mark Carney officially took office as Prime Minister of Canada in the spring of 2025, it looked less like a normal change of power and more like the beginning of a new era. He did not come from the political arena, but from a world where people think in trillions and in terms of decades, not electoral cycles. Unlike most of his predecessors, Carney did not base his campaign on promises of social justice or climate slogans. He spoke of the country's strategic survival in a world where the United States no longer guarantees stability. When he delivered his first speech in Parliament, his words sounded like a manifesto. America has become an unpredictable partner. We can no longer build our future based on the mood of others. These words initially caused shock, but within a few weeks they had become a new foreign policy doctrine.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Carney understood that rhetoric alone would not build independence. His team of former economists, lawyers, and international finance experts developed a document in a matter of months that was unofficially named the Economic Sovereignty Plan. It covered everything from export diversification to internal trade liberalization between provinces. There were no grandiose slogans in this plan, only concrete steps. The removal of dozens of bureaucratic barriers between regions, the accelerated approval of infrastructure projects, and tax incentives for companies that reorient themselves from the American market to the Asian or European markets. At the same time, the Carney government launched the largest infrastructure renewal campaign in 40 years. The Major Projects Office was given extraordinary powers. The time required to approve national projects was reduced from 6 years to 2. Within a few months, construction began on high-speed railways connecting the ports of Halifax and Vancouver with industrial centers. According to official data, more than 300,000 jobs were created in the first half of the year, and private investment in transport and logistics grew by 40%. For the first time, international rating agencies ranked Canada above the United States in terms of macroeconomic stability. While Washington was discussing new tariffs and threats of sanctions, Ottawa acted quietly but effectively. In June, an expanded strategic pact was signed with the European Union, which effectively made Canada a European bridgehead in North America. In the fall, the country signed its first ever bilateral agreement with Indonesia, opening up access to a market of 270 million people. During the same period, Carney negotiated mutual recognition of standards for energy equipment with Australia, allowing Canadian companies to bypass US licenses for the first time in decades. None of this looked like a major diplomatic victory, but together it formed the foundation of a new economic reality in which Canada could exist without American mediation.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
But the most impressive effect of his policies was not felt on the international stage, but at home. Carney began restructuring the domestic market so that the country would no longer depend on imports from the US, even in basic industries. The One Canadian Economy Act eliminated internal trade barriers between provinces, transforming disparate economic zones into a single space. The result was staggering. The cost of interregional transportation fell by a third, and productivity in the logistics sector grew by 15%. Economists called it the second birth of the Confederation. At the same time, the government cut taxes for the middle class and small businesses and reduced capital gains tax for investors working in priority sectors. These measures sparked an explosion of business activity. The Toronto Stock Index broke its historical record, and foreign investment in private Canadian companies reached a level not seen since the oil boom of the 1970s.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
But Carney's success was not only reflected in the numbers. He managed to do what politicians rarely succeed in doing: unite the nation around the idea of economic dignity. When reports of a decline in American tourism began to appear in the media, the reaction of Canadians was not malicious, but almost philosophical. People simply stopped spending money in a country whose leaders called them freeloaders. In 1 year, the number of trips Canadians took to the US fell by a third. This meant a loss of $20 billion for the American economy, but for Canada, it was a sign of a new era of consumer patriotism. Instead of shopping in New York, they bought from local designers. Instead of vacationing in Florida, they went to the mountain resorts of Alberta. Even the advertising of large chains struck a new note. Leave your money at home, it's working for your future. The US felt this blow painfully. Small towns in upstate New York and Maine were deserted, and tourist buses stopped crossing the border. American analysts tried to explain this as a temporary mood, but the data told a different story. The trend was here to stay. Canada did not declare a boycott, but acted as a single entity, instinctively protecting itself from economic dependence.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
While Trump increased the pressure, threatening to punish Canada for refusing to comply, Carney responded with diplomacy and cold logic. In his speeches, he emphasized, "This is not a trade war. This is growing up." And this growing up manifested a new mentality. A country that had been perceived as a shadow of the US for decades was now becoming an independent player. In the fall of 2025, Ottawa and Mexico City announced a joint economic platform called the North Continental Initiative, the first project in history to be coordinated without Washington's participation. Its meaning was simple: to unite the production chains of Canada and Mexico in order to minimize both countries' dependence on American imports. The initiative included plans to build transit ports on the east and west coasts, establish direct sea routes between Halifax and Veracruz, and invest in joint industrial zones. This move came as a shock to the White House, which was accustomed to believing that relations between Canada and Mexico were only possible through US mediation.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
At the same time, energy independence was being strengthened. Several large provinces, including British Columbia and Quebec, imposed restrictions on electricity exports to the US, citing the need for long-term energy security. American companies dependent on Canadian supplies began to lose billions. The irony was that it was Trump's tariff policy that made the American energy sector vulnerable. Rising steel and aluminum prices delayed the construction of power lines, and now the country was forced to buy energy from a neighbor who was in no hurry to sell it. By the end of the year, Canada had become a rare example of a country that had managed to turn external pressure into a catalyst for its own strengthening. Infrastructure grew, exports diversified, and foreign exchange reserves increased. International analysts at the Financial Times wrote that in 1 year, Ottawa had done what other countries take decades to achieve. And within the country, a new pride had formed not on an emotional level, but on an institutional one.